One of Nasruddin's rich neighbours gave a big party one evening, but he forgot to invite him. Nasruddin waited and waited, but no invitation came. So at last, when the party had already begun, he took a piece of paper, folded it, put it in an envelope, and took it to his neighbour's house. "I have a very important letter for the host," he said to the servants at the door. The servants took him into the big room where everybody was eating. Nasruddin gave the letter to his rich neighbour, and at once sat down and began to fill his mouth with food. The host looked at the envelope, but there was nothing on it, so he said, "Are you sure that this letter is for me? There's no address on it." "Oh, yes," said Nasruddin, "and there's no writing inside it either, because it was prepared in a hurry."
One evening there was a big dance at the hotel in our town. One of the guests at the dance was a man of about 40, who thought he was so handsome that every girl who saw him would fall in love with him. At the beginning of one of the dances, he saw a pretty young woman who was standing beside an older lady at the edge of the dance floor. He went up to the girl and asked her to dance. She had seen him dancing before, so she knew that he was a good dancer, and as she too liked dancing, she accepted. After they had danced several dances together, the man led her into the garden and said, "Do you tell your mother everything that you do?" "Of course not," she answered sweetly. "She doesn't mind what I do now, but my husband always wants to know."
John liked to wear his hair very long. Some of his friends thought that it looked like a girl's hair, but they never made jokes about it, because John was a big, strong young man, and he didn't think jokes about his hair funny. John always went to the barber's twice a month to have his hair cut and washed, and one day the barber said to him, "Now, why don't you let me cut most of this hair off and make your head tidy? Nobody would recognize you if I did that, I'm sure." John said nothing for a few seconds, and then he said, "Perhaps you're right, but I'm sure that nobody would recognize you either if you did that to my hair."
On Saturday mornings, our cinema shows films for children. One such morning, an old man took his grandchildren to the cinema. At the door, there was a list of the prices of tickets, but he couldn't see any price for tickets for adults for Saturday mornings. The only price which was shown for that time was for children's tickets. So he asked the lady who was selling the tickets how much it was for adults. "Adults?" she said. "No, we don't have prices for tickets for adults for our Saturday morning films. Any adult who's brave enough to go in there to see films like that, and with all those children, can go in free."
A small talking dog was a big success when it came to our theatre. It told jokes, sang songs, and did a lot of other funny things on the stage. But while it was singing one of its songs, a bigger dog came into the theatre, stopped, listened for a few moments, and then ran up and jumped onto the stage. The small talking dog tried to get away, but the bigger dog caught it by the skin of its neck and carried it off the stage. Just as the two animals were disappearing behind the curtains at the side of the stage, the small talking dog said, "I'm sorry about this, everybody. This is my mother. She doesn't want me to be an actor. She wants me to become a doctor."
Mrs. Robinson always seemed to be ill and unhappy. She often had painful headaches, and medicines didn't seem to make her any better. So at last her husband took her to a good doctor. The doctor examined her carefully, and asked her a lot of questions. Then he suddenly put his arms around her and gave her a big kiss. Mrs. Robinson at once looked better and happier. "You see," said the doctor to her husband, "that is all she needs. I suggest that she has the same thing every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday." And he smiled. "Well," said Mr. Robinson, "I can bring her on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but not on Saturdays, because I always go sailing on that day."
A pretty, well-dressed young lady stopped a taxi in a big square and said to the driver, "Do you see that young man at the other side of this square?" "Yes," said the taxi driver. The young man was standing outside a restaurant and looking impatiently at his watch every few seconds. "Take me over there," said the young lady. There were a lot of cars and buses and trucks in the square, so the taxi driver asked, "Are you afraid to cross the street?" "Oh, no," said the young lady, "but I'm 3/4 of an hour late. I said that I would meet that young man for lunch at 1 o'clock, and it's now 1:45. If I arrive in a taxi, it will at least seem as if I have tried not to be too late."
Mr. Robinson worked in an office. Every morning he had breakfast with his wife at 7:30, read his newspaper, drank a cup of coffee, and then left his house at 8 o'clock to go to catch his train to town. One morning he was still sitting comfortably at the breakfast table and reading his newspaper at 5 minutes past 8. He didn't seem to be in a hurry and asked his wife for another cup of coffee. "Another cup?" she asked. "But aren't you going to the office today? Have you got a holiday?" "The office?" he said, and looked up from his newspaper, very surprised. "I thought that I was at the office."
Mr. Black gave his wife money every Friday evening, but she always spent it before the next Wednesday, so that for the next 3 days she had none. Every Tuesday evening Mr. Black asked her, "But what did you spend all that money on?" And she always answered, "I don't know." One Friday, Mr. Black brought home an exercise book and a pencil, and gave them to his wife with her money. "Now look," he said to her, "when you get money from me, write it down on this page, and on the opposite page write down what happens to the money." When Mr. Black came home the next Tuesday, his wife came to him and showed him the book. "I've done what you told me," she said happily. On one page she'd written, "Friday the 28th of June, I got £18 from John." And on the opposite page, "Tuesday the 2nd of July, I've spent it all."
A letter to a magazine. Dear Sirs, last year I saw an article in your magazine. I think it was in your magazine, but I am not sure, which interested me very much, but I have forgotten what it was. I wrote the name of the article and the magazine in my notebook after I had read it, but I have lost the notebook. I have also lost the magazine which the article was in. Will you please send me another copy of the magazine, if it was your magazine? Thank you very much. Yours faithfully, David Williams.
The lights were red, so my taxi had to stop. When they changed to green again, an old lady was slowly crossing the street in front of the taxi, so of course the driver waited. But as soon as the driver of the car behind saw the green light, he began to blow his horn. My taxi driver calmly opened his door, got out, pointed to the driver's seat which he had just left, and said to the man who was blowing the horn, "Sir, You get into my taxi and drive over her. I always feel so uncomfortable when I drive over old ladies.
A man was mending a street lamp when he saw a pretty young woman and 3 children get into a car which was in the garden of a house near him. He saw that the car had a flat tire and tried to warn the woman, but it was too late. She was already driving the car out of the garden and into the busy street. When she'd got there, she stopped the car at the side of the street, got out and looked at the flat tire. The children stayed in the car. Very soon another car stopped, and the driver offered to help her. The young woman accepted his offer, and the man changed the tire for her. When she'd thanked him and he'd gone, she drove the car back into the garden, got out with the children, and went back to her work in the house with clean hands.
A man wanted to sell his old horse, so he took him to the market. Because the horse was old, nobody wanted to buy him. But at last a young man stopped in front of him and said, "How old is he?" "He's 21 years old," said the older man. "How long have you had him?" "I've had him for nearly 19 years. "And what's his name?" "I don't know, but I call him Tom."
A man heard that a certain government department wanted a clerk, so he wrote and asked for the position. But while he was waiting for an answer, a friend of his introduced him to the head of the department, who at once gave him the job. Several months later, while the man was working in the department, he got a letter which had been sent on to him from his old address. This letter said, "Dear Sir, we are sorry to have to tell you that we cannot offer you work in this department, because we do not think that you would be able to do the job successfully. Yours faithfully." The man laughed, but when he looked at the letter more carefully, he saw that he had signed it himself.
Tom was only 7 years old. So when he went off to camp with a lot of other small boys one summer, his mother thought that he might be unhappy, and arranged for all his aunts and his grandmother and all his other relatives to write to him, so that he would get a letter every day while he was away from home. Well, of course, he didn't write to anybody while he was at the camp. A few days after he came back home, his mother saw him looking at some papers and asked him what they were. "Oh," he said, "they're the letters I got while I was at the camp. I didn't have time to look at them while I was there."
George had worked for the Bank of Ruritania for 10 years and was still only a clerk. He wasn't satisfied with his position and wanted to find something better. But he also didn't want to lose his position in the bank before he'd got another one. So he prepared a letter about himself with the words, "Help! I am a prisoner of the Bank of Ruritania," in big letters across the top, and sent it to several big companies, asking them for a job. A few days later, one of these letters came into the hands of George's chief at the bank. Someone had given it to him at his club. The next morning, George's chief asked him to come into his room and said, "George, I have some very good news for you. The Bank of Ruritania is setting you free."
A beautiful and very successful actress was the star of a new musical show. Her home was in the country, but she didn't want to have to go back there every night, so she rented an expensive flat in the centre of the city, bought some beautiful furniture, and hired a man to paint the rooms in new colours. It was very difficult to get tickets for her show, because everybody wanted to see it. So she decided to give the painter 2 of the best seats. She hoped that this would make him work better and more willingly for her. He took the tickets without saying anything, and she heard no more about them until the end of the month, when she got the painter's bill. At the bottom of it were the words, 4 hours watching Miss Hall sing and dance, £3. With this note, after 5 p.m. I get 15 shillings an hour instead of 10 shillings.
Olives are about the same size as grapes, but they taste very different. Some are bitter, some are sour, and some are very salty. Men and women eat them with drinks before a meal, but children usually don't like them at all. Mr. Gray was drinking beer and eating olives when his small son Tommy came in. He saw that his father liked the olives very much, so he said, "May I have one, father?" "Yes," answered his father. "Take one and try it." Tommy took one. He thought it tasted terrible. He watched his father take another and eat it. He could see that he was enjoying it. So Tommy tried another olive, but that was just as terrible as the first. "You are taking all the good ones," he cried, "and leaving the bad ones for me."
A young lion came to a small zoo in Europe. In the next cage was a tired old lion, which did nothing except lie about and sleep. Lions ought not to behave like that, the young lion said to himself. So he roared at all the visitors and tried to break the bars of the cage. At 3 o'clock, a man brought a big piece of meat and put it in the old lion's cage. Then he put a bag of nuts and 2 bananas in the young lion's cage. The young lion was very surprised. "I don't understand this," he said to the old lion. "I behave like a real lion, while you lie there and do nothing, and look what happens." "Well, you see," said the old lion kindly, "this is a small zoo. They haven't got enough money for 2 lions, so in their books you're here as a monkey."
Very few people were coming to eat at the White Rose restaurant, and its owner didn't know what to do. The food in his restaurant was cheap and good, but nobody seemed to want to eat there. Then he did something that changed all that, and in a few weeks his restaurant was always full of men with their lady friends. Whenever a gentleman came in with a lady, a smiling waiter gave each of them a beautiful menu. The menus looked exactly the same on the outside, but there was an important difference inside. The menu that the waiter gave to the man gave the correct price for each dish and each bottle of wine, while the menu that he gave to the lady gave a much higher price. So when the man calmly ordered dish after dish and wine after wine, the lady thought he was much more generous than he really was.
Until a few years ago, only boys could become students at the University of Ruritania. Then the university decided to allow girls in. But one of the lecturers, Dr. Goller, was not at all pleased. He hadn't wanted to let girl students in. Dr. Goller always used to begin his lectures with the word, "Gentlemen." What would he do now? Well, when girl students came to his lectures for the first time, he continued to begin with the word "gentlemen." For him, the girls were just not there. Then one day, there was only one boy in his class among a lot of girls. For a moment, Dr. Goller didn't know what to do. Then he began, "Sir." Finally, a terrible day came when there were no boys in his class. He came into the room, looked at the sea of girls, said, "Oh, nobody's here today," turned and went out without giving his lecture.
During the last war, most of the men were fighting or working in factories, so it was very difficult to find men to do other work. The headmaster of a school wanted a gardener, but the only person he was able to get was an old retired farmer. The old man worked so hard in the school garden that the headmaster became worried. He thought that the old man might get ill or die if he continued like that. So he suggested to him that he should work more slowly and rest more. But the old man continued to work as before. At last the headmaster went to the man's wife and asked her to speak to her husband. "All right," she answered, "but I don't think it will do any good. You see, he has worked for himself all his life, never for anybody else, so he has just never learnt to work slowly."
An old lady who lived in a village went into town one Saturday, and after she had bought fruit and vegetables in the market for herself and for a friend who was ill, she went into a shop which sold glasses. She tried one pair of glasses, and then another pair and another, but none of them seemed to be right. The shopkeeper was a very patient man, and after some time he said to the old lady, "Now, don't worry, madam. Everything will be all right in the end. It isn't easy to get just the right glasses, you know." "No, it isn't," answered the old lady, "and it's even more difficult when you're shopping for a friend."
A rich man and his wife went into a shop to buy a bracelet. Neither of them was very young. They looked at a lot of beautiful bracelets, and after half an hour there were two which they liked very much, but they hadn't yet been able to choose between them. One of them was very expensive, and the other was quite a lot cheaper. Of course, the shopkeeper wanted to sell them the more expensive one, because then he would get more money from them. So he said to the lady, "Oh, go on, spend his money. If you don't, he'll only spend it on his second wife." For several seconds nobody said a word, and then the lady said angrily, "I am his second wife."
The air hostess was in the small kitchen at the back of the aeroplane preparing the trays for lunch when a little old lady came and spoke to her. "Could you please tell me," she asked, "where the ladies' lavatory is in this aeroplane?" "Yes, madam," said the air hostess, and smiled. "It's right at the other end of the aeroplane, at the front." The little old lady went too far. She walked all the way to the front of the aeroplane, opened the door in front of her, and saw the captain of the aeroplane and the other officers. They were all busy at their work and didn't see her. She went out again, shut the door, and returned to the air hostess. "Oh, didn't you find it, madam?" the girl asked her. "Yes, I did," said the little old lady. "But there are 4 men in the ladies' lavatory watching television."
The soldiers had been marching up and down in the square for an hour, while their officer shouted orders, and they were all tired, hot, and unhappy. They were marching towards a big building, when they suddenly realized that the officer had not left himself enough time to give the order to turn round or to stop. So they were going to march straight into the wall. The soldiers smiled happily as each of those in the front line decided at the same time to walk straight ahead. There was a loud noise as they hit the wall, one after another. But before any of them had time to smile again, the officer shouted, "If you men had been in a really straight line, I would have heard only one sound when you hit that wall."
Mrs. Williams is very proud of her house because it is always clean and tidy. But one day, while she was sweeping the carpets, she saw a little mouse run across her dining room floor. She had always told other people that mice are found only in dirty houses, so she was terribly ashamed when she saw a mouse in her own house. She quickly called her daughter and said to her, "A terrible thing has happened. I saw a mouse in our dining room a few minutes ago. We must catch it at once. Go down to the village shop and buy a mouse trap. But whatever you do, don't tell anybody what it is for."